So I imagine we're just gonna start talking, and then eventually we'll kind of hit the natural pace of a conversation, and then we can get into like the exact, you know, thing we came here to discuss, which is like your book, right? Recording is on now, though,
Sure.
just so you know.
Right, right.
You're a writer. You wrote the book Burning Country, Syrians and Revolution and War, and that was in 2018, right?
Was it 2018? It probably was 2018. I co-wrote it.
Oh, you co-wrote
I,
it.
I wrote it with Leila al-Shami.
Ah,
It
yes.
was a joint endeavor between me and Leila. And I've written a novel too, and some short stories and essays and things like that, journalism, book reviews.
Would you say that you're gonna focus on making the short stories in fiction, or would you make another? If you were to make another book today, would it be on sort of fiction or like the nonfiction?
Well, both. I mean, if I had time, I would. Actually started. I've written the first fifth of a novel, which was going pretty well, and then I suddenly got two jobs, so it's not going pretty well at the moment. But I would like to publish another novel. I've written a lot of essays for the Critical Muslim, which is a journal published by Hearst, which I helped to edit. So I could maybe one day I'll put those essays together into a non-fiction book. But yeah, I would like to write more fiction, and I've kept trying to write fiction, but I haven't until after my first novel. I haven't finished a novel, or I haven't got a novel to a position which I was happy with. Although I constantly try. I've written thousands and thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of words, but I haven't, apart from the first novel, I haven't finished one. I haven't got one to a position that I think is coherent and finished. But I would like to write more fiction. I think fiction is an important thing, and more of us should spend more time reading fiction. And it's a bad thing that we spend so much time on the internet, and our brains are shrinking as a result, and our span is. And of course, it's really important to, like me, for the last year, I've been addicted to this because of what's happening in mine. As I was for a long period addicted to the news about Syria and addicted to hearing from people kind of on the ground in Syria.
Right.
Good and important, and it's natural and good that you should be trying to follow as closely as possible by whatever means your age offers you whatever is happening in the world, especially big dramas and like genocide. But at the same time, I don't think it's good for our brains. I think it's better for our brains to engage with a long novel. So we're concentrating on an imaginary world for hours and days and weeks at a time. And that helps our brains to do all kinds of unconscious work, complex work, drawing complicated parallels and contrasts and so on between things, making connections, which we don't do when we're just looking at the screen and we're just getting an update every couple of seconds, another kind of bite of information. It's good to have this long, complex engagement with texts and with imagined models of reality. I think that helps us do all kinds of thinking and feeling that we aren't able to do when we're just on social media or looking at news updates.
I'll be honest, I don't read a lot of fiction these days. Anyway, I'll be honest, I don't read a lot of fiction these days. I mostly read nonfiction, including your book. I'm reading through your book at the moment. I think that now would be a good time, to introduce kind of like yourself to like the audience. Exactly, like what do you do? What would you say your work on the book we're discussing today, Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War. What would you say that's kind of about? Yeah.
Well, who am I and what do I do? Robin Yassin-Kassab, my father was, Ali Yarhamu, my father was Syrian. My mother is English, but she thinks of herself as Scottish now. I live in Scotland, but I have lived in Syria, and I lived in Syria at the end of the 1990s when Hafez al-Assad was in charge. I lived there for 3.5 years. I lived in Morocco for a couple of years, in Saudi for a couple of years, in the Sultanate of Oman for 5 years. I lived in Pakistan for a year, in Turkey for a year. But the place that I've lived longest is Scotland, where I live now. I lived for a section of my childhood here, and I live here now. And I've done various things in my life, including teaching English and working as a journalist. As I said, I wrote a novel. I've written this nonfiction book, co-written this nonfiction book. I did a lot of book reviews for The Guardian and bits of journalism for various people. At the moment, I'm the chief English editor of the ISIS Prisons Museum, which is a new and interesting project, which I encourage everybody to look up. It's a website, although we have some physical exhibitions too.
I'll include a link in the
and
description.
That's based. Yeah, sure. So the ISIS Prisons Museum is a really interesting project, and it's a grassroots project started up by Syrian journalists. And the reason they started that up was because some of their colleagues were disappeared by ISIS. So they went, after ISIS ran away, they went into the buildings that ISIS had taken control of, and they found tens of thousands of documents left behind, and they filmed every inch of every wall in every ISIS prison. And look at the website and you'll see what we've done out of it in special investigations and 3D tours. And it's a growing project. It's also going to be a repository of prison experiences, because of course ISIS didn't come out of a vacuum. The surveillance and detention and torture techniques that it practiced, it learned from the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, the Saddam Hussein regime, the American occupation prisons in Iraq. And they in turn learned from the Soviet Union and from Nazi Germany and so on. So all of these systems, people held in Guantanamo Bay by the Americans, they were threatened that if they didn't talk, they would be sent to Syria to be tortured. So all of these prison systems feed into each other, whether they are, whatever the ideology that they claim, or whether they're supposedly enemies or not, they all learn from each other, these prison systems. So I do that at the moment, and I edit, or I'm one of the editors of a quarterly journal that looks like a book called The Critical Muslim, which is published by Hearst in the UK, and you can buy that online, and it comes out 4 times a year, and each issue has a special theme. So we've just done, it's not yet published, the genocide theme, inspired by what's happening in Palestine. But there are essays in there about the genocides in Syria, in Chechnya, in the Pakistan-Bangladesh thing, the genocides from all over the world. Bosnia, I've just been to Bosnia in order to write an essay for that issue. So I write essays for them, and sometimes short fiction, and I help to edit them. So that's what I do. And then the book, Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, which I co-wrote with Leila al-Shami, it's a contextualization of the Syrian Revolution. It's burning country, Syrians in revolution and war. So it's about where did the revolution come from? Why was there a revolution? In which context did the revolution arrive? And then how did the revolution turn into a war? How did the counter-revolution turn it into a war in which foreign powers and terrorist groups got involved? That's basically what it's about. It's also tries to look at the Syrian revolution from the grassroots, a Syrian context, and to give the voices themselves who were involved in it. Because one of the things that made us want to write the book was that we realized that everybody outside who was talking about Syria wasn't actually talking about Syria. They were talking about geopolitics, or they were talking about their own assumptions of the world into which they wanted to fit Syria.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? So there were people who thought,
I hate when people do that.
Go on, what are you saying?
I hate when people do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really very annoying that they didn't feel the need, whether they were on the right or the left. Most people didn't seem to feel the need to actually engage with what was happening and find out the facts and talk to Syrians and ask Syrians what's going on. Why are you going out and risking your lives to protest and things like that? They didn't feel they needed to because they had a ready explanation. They thought, it's an Arab country and, it's next to Iraq, so it must be that America is causing the trouble because America's into regime change. And, for example, or, well, the regime is, the president is an Alawi, which is kind of connected to the Shia thing, so it must all fit into the Sunni-Shia conflict. It's part of the eternal Sunni-Shia conflict, for example. Or if they were on the right, or actually for a lot of people on the left too, it must be to do with al-Qaeda. It must be part of the war on terror stuff. And people actually, especially on the left, a lot of leftists who thought that it must be a regime change operation, and therefore I should be supporting President Assad. And President Assad says he's fighting terrorists, and indeed there are terrorist groups there. So I'm going to decide to talk about the whole thing as if it's a part of the war on terror, which was just crazy that left-wing people who, a few years previously had opposed war on terror rhetoric and had said, no, that's far too simplistic. You can't reduce everything that's happening in the Middle East or in the Muslim world to terrorism. And you can't just hit it with a violent mallet to make the terrorists go away. That's crazy. But then when it came to Syria, quite a lot of them started using the same rhetoric. Mm-hmm. So it was because of things like that. Because we thought that people were missing the point. They weren't looking at the Syrian revolution in a nuanced way. They weren't listening to Syrians. They weren't asking Syrians what they thought, and they were trying to fit it into pre-existent, preconceived categories which didn't actually work. They didn't actually explain what was happening in Syria. So that's why we wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. I think, that's a very important thing to tackle. That's a very important thing to tackle. I remember maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, the way the war was being presented, from a very loud vocal group on the internet, was that it was basically, Assad against a bunch of terrorists, and it didn't even matter what reason people were revolting or things like that. I always like speaking with Syrians because they give an entirely different perspective on it. I know people who are Syrian in my life who, I always feel the need to ask them because I'm just so interested in the dissonance between how the issue is presented online by a bunch of Twitter accounts and the actual people who have a stake in the issue, and they all hate Bashar. They all hate this guy. So it's so weird having this kind of dissonance. It's weird. I wanted to ask you on the issue of, I'm reading the history right now. I'm going through actually the process of making a video on this. And you mentioned people viewing this as an Alawi thing, or people viewing this as like in a sectarian lens, and people viewing the revolution in a sectarian lens. And I think that lens can be very harmful to use, but I'm also pretty aware that I think that this is how Assad views the revolution, right? He views, and how he views his people too. It seems he can't seem to not view politics in Syria through this kind of sectarian lens. So how do you kind of navigate that? Because I really hate sectarianism, and I want to be able to look at how Assad views the conflict, Assad views the war, Assad views the revolution, and it seems he views it in a sectarian lens, right? So how would you suggest someone reconcile that?
Absolutely, and I'm not disputing for a moment that the situation, the war in revolution and then war, the revolution was not a sectarian thing.
Right.
And of course there were. I mean, the revolution contained many millions of people. It was and like any street movement, it covered all kinds of people. So there were a few people. There was a small minority of Syrians who protesting Syrians, who did have sectarian aims, if you like, whose first problem was that they were Sunnis being ruled by Alawis.
Mm-hmm.
But that. And there were people who, of course, because this has got a history. I mean, there are Sunni Muslim communities that have been horribly repressed for decades in a sectarian way, by a divide and rule fascist regime.
Yes.
So, there are the people who remember the war on the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s, and the destruction of the city of Hama, and the murder of tens of thousands of civilians there by Alawis, basically because they were Sunnis in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mm-hmm. So there are people, and there are people with connections to Al-Qaeda and so on. All of those people exist and were part of the revolution. But the vast majority of people, working class and middle class, were people who were outraged by the regime because it was torturing them, and because it was terribly corrupt. Because in the old days under Hafiz al-Assad, it had always been terribly corrupt, and it's tortured and ruled by fear, and people had always disagreed with it. But on the other hand, it had done some things to keep some sections of society happy. So there had been subsidies, for example, there were kind of top-down socialist style policies in some cases, to an extent.
Yeah.
So there had been subsidies for fuel and food, so that the poorest people in society could get petrol and get mazut, get heating oil for their homes in the winter, and they could get rice and bread and basic foodstuffs with subsidies, so that they didn't starve. And then under Bashar al-Assad, he brought in some kind of what you could call neoliberal economic reforms and took away those subsidies. So suddenly it was like, well, God, not just you're humiliating us and torturing us if we speak against you, and torturing our children, for God's sake, and doing things internationally like cooperating with Israel, although you pretend not to, which we disapprove of. Not only are you kind of corrupt and looting the country, but you're not even giving us the ability to eat, which your father used to do. It's for these kind of basic reasons that the revolution broke out, not because of sectarianism. Mm-hmm. And the proof of that is that there were Christians and Alawis and Ismailis and atheists and agnostics who were involved in the revolution. And at the beginning, the head of the people who founded the big two umbrella groups of coordinating committees that organized protests and civil action were both women. Both unveiled women who didn't wear the hijab, and that was completely normal. And everybody was out there in the streets protesting together, and it didn't matter particularly what their religion was. But the regime responded to this. the regime is a sectarian regime. It's sectarian through and through. Now, that doesn't mean that it's sectarian in the way that Saudi Arabia used to be, not anymore, or the way that Iran is today.
I'm more
in Iran today,
Lebanon in terms of sectarianism.
the people. Go on.
I'm more thinking of Lebanon when I think.
Sorry.
When you say the word, when someone says the word sectarianism, I think Lebanon.
Yeah. Well, that's a good example, because in Lebanon you've got a sectarian system which the French invented.
Yeah.
And it's been and the French invented a sectarian system where the president has to be a Maronite Christian, and the prime minister has to be Sunni, and the speaker of parliament has to be Shi'i, and the way that politics works by the constitution, and it's been modified since after the Civil War and so on. But basically, it's a sectarian constitution. It's a sectarian polity. The tools of the state which allow people to do politics only allow them to do politics through their sect. So therefore, it's inevitably sectarian, even though there are a lot of people in Lebanon, a large minority at least, and perhaps a majority, who aren't interested in sect and would rather do it in a different way. But because the system is set up in a sectarian way, they're kind of stuck at the moment until the whole thing somehow gets overturned. Now, in Syria, it's a similar thing, that the majority of people, certainly in 2011, a large majority of people didn't want a sectarian. They weren't having a revolution because they wanted a Sunni state.
Yeah.
An Islamic state. Yeah. Or because, they just wanted dignity and a better economy, less corruption. They didn't want to live in fear. They didn't want to be ruled by gangsters. They wanted some kind of representative government. And but the regime responded in a sectarian manner. And that's what I was saying, that it is a sectarian regime through and through. Not the people in charge are personally committed to their religion.
Right.
And they want to impose their religious ideas on others. That's the difference from Iran. I think that Khamenei in Iran, for example, although he's also just interested in naked power, but it is a Shia regime in the sense that they believe absolutely in their religion, and they believe that they've got the right way of imposing their religious ideas on other people and spreading their religion. I don't think the Assad regime is like that. I don't think they want to convert anybody to the Alawi faith, or that they care or are interested in the Alawi faith. They're interested in their own bank accounts and their own power and their own immunity from punishment. They're gangsters, basically. The Syrian regime is a gangster regime, but the key and most important way in which it rules is by divide and rule. It does that by exploiting sectarian fears and resentments, and not just sectarian, also tribal and regional and familial, any kind of division in society which they can exploit, they will. And they've done it very effectively, and they've done it by creating, they deliberately sectarianized the revolution. In 2011, they released from prison thousands of jihadi guys who'd been fighting in Iraq. They'd gone off and fought the Americans and the Shia government in Iraq. When they came back to Syria, they were arrested and put in prison. And then in 2011, when the revolution broke out, they were released from prison at the same moment that the regime was rounding up thousands of anti-sectarian, non-violent young people, activists, and torturing them to death. At the same moment, it released the violent jihadi sectarians from prison. And according to some defectors, actually helped them then, gave them logistical help in helping them set up militias. And these were militias in some cases that came to dominate when the revolution turned into a war in response to extreme regime violence. These ruthless armed Islamist groups came to to dominate. And that was a great thing for the regime,
Right.
because the Alawis and the Christians and the atheists and the urban middle classes, who were attracted by the potential of a democracy, or the potential of a less corrupt economy, or the potential of a Syrian polity which was not ruled by fear, by gangsters. When those people saw Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Jaish al-Islam, and forced hijab, and you know, closing down the bars and whipping people in the streets who said the wrong thing, then they thought, for God's sake, we don't want that. And Alawis in particular thought, these people will murder us. And they were right when it came to ISIS, certainly. These people will murder us just because we're Alawis. You know, they will certainly murder us because our sect has been implicated in sectarian massacres, because our sect is overrepresented in the military, because all the officers in the army and in the security forces are, and in the torture chambers are Alawis. So they will definitely come after us for that reason, and they will even murder us just because we're not Sunni Muslims. So we now have no choice but to stand with Bashar al-Assad. We have no choice. It's just a question of survival for us. And you can understand that thinking. I disagree, but I can completely understand it. And also the West. So the West that didn't actually support the Syrian Revolution properly, we can come back to that anyway,
I
at all,
would, yeah.
and doesn't want democracy, doesn't want democracy in the Arab world, doesn't want representative governments. It's happy that the Arabs are ruled by dictators, by gangsters, because they can. It's much easier for them to manipulate the gangsters than it is to manipulate whole societies. So they didn't actually support the revolution, but there was a point at which they weren't exactly opposing it at the beginning, and that was problematic for Assad. But once you've got groups like ISIS, once he's managed to create the conditions in which Al-Qaeda and Nusra and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and ISIS and others will dominate on the battlefield, then they say, well, God, we'd rather have this guy, even if he's responsible for 80% of the civilian death and displacement. We would rather have him because he's not threatening to come to Europe and murder us, whereas ISIS is. You know, ISIS wants to attack us in London and Paris and New York and so on, and it's shouting about how it's going to destroy us. So that's our real enemy. We'll let this guy stay there if the alternative is ISIS. So he deliberately created the sectarian conditions and the violence, the scorched earth situation out of which these Islamists, both certain key sections of Syrian society who he needed to be loyal, would be loyal, and also so that the West would be loyal and would allow Iran and Russia to go in there and destroy the country on his behalf.
God, what a piece of shit. What an ass.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
I hate that guy.
Then, unfortunately, tragically, look at the whole... I mean, I think Assad is the worst in the Arab world. I think he's the worst in the world, really. In terms of slaughtering who are supposed to be his own people. But look at the whole Arab world. I mean, it's been exposed. The disaster of the whole of the Arab world, the political disaster, has been exposed, if it needed exposing, since October the 7th last year. Because there's been a year of unambiguous, continuous, daily genocide of the Palestinians and the destruction of Palestine, so that in Gaza, I mean, you're never going to be able to, for a century, that place is not going to be sorted out.
Yeah.
And the Arabs are doing, not only are they doing nothing about it, but they're helping. You know, there are Arabs who are Arab states which are delivering foodstuffs to Israeli ports and delivering weapons which the Americans asked to transfer through their territory, and taking, you know, sharing intelligence with them, and not doing what they should be doing, which is I'm not suggesting that Arab states declare war on Israel, because of course they're just not capable of doing it. Maybe if they spent the last decades preparing for that, they would be in a position where they're capable, but they're not. Okay, we understand that. But they could at least stop doing business with Israel.
Yeah.
They could at least make it expensive for the Western powers, for America, which is supplying the weapons and the money, which is directly transferring billions of dollars to keep the Israeli economy going as it commits genocide. They could at least say, look, we don't want to fight you, but we can't do business with you when you're killing our people. Sorry, but we can't. You know, you wouldn't do that. No European power would do business with Russia when it's slaughtering people in Ukraine, and that's good. They're correct to behave with that dignity. We just have to behave with the minimum amounts of dignity. So you can't use our ports. We can't sell you oil and gas. We can't. You can't use our countries to have military bases. So long as you're doing this. Once you stop committing genocide against our brothers and sisters, then we'll be happy to do business with you. But they can't do that because they are not scared of their own people. They're gangsters in every case who are scared of their foreign sponsors.
Yeah.
That's a disaster for the Arab world.
If you look
as long as we don't have democracy in the Arab world, we will continue to have foreign powers committing genocides against us.
Yeah. And if you look at one of the only states who's, putting any type of kind of like a geopolitical cost on Israel and its supporters, it's Iraq, which, it's not perfect, but they do have elections. They do have a democracy to some extent. And they're the only ones saying we don't want any more U.S. bases in our country, and they're set to push them out by 2026. So it is interesting. I think your point is very well substantiated. Yeah. I wanted to ask, because you seem to be on a roll on shitting on these, especially because Syria was part of this broader Arab Spring thing. What are your opinions on the Kais Saied in Tunisia, the president of Tunisia?
Well, again, that's a terrible nightmare. What a disaster that it seemed for a while that Tunisia was the one success story of the Arab Spring. It wasn't a total success. People expect maybe too much. It didn't turn into a glorious,
utopia,
socialist state, the utopia, etc., etc., etc. It's a country with big trouble, but it did seem that at least parliamentary democracy had been installed, and you had an exchange of power several times between the Nahda, who are kind of liberal Islamists, pretty progressive Islamists, democratic Islamists in the Nahda party, and the more leftist group, and they were able to exchange power without fighting, and the economic troubles that still remained. There was still a lot of economic problems, a lot of class problems, and other problems. I'm not an expert on Tunisia, but just it was a disaster that this dictatorship has been re-established in Tunisia, and that the opposition has been put in prison, and the press is more tightly controlled, and the guy is a horrible person. He's using the great replacement theory, which is a racist conspiracy theory, which is more often used in America and Europe, which says that globalists or Jews are organizing the migration of Muslims and blacks into the West in order to destroy Western society. They're trying the great replacement. They're replacing white people. And Saeed is using the same crazy racist theory to claim that black Africans are being, there's an international plot to bring black Africans into Tunisia to stop being a Muslim and Arab country.
Yeah.
Which is insanity. The proportion, there are people trying to migrate to Europe from Black Africa who are going through Tunisia, but it's still a very small percentage of the population that's in Tunisia. It's not a crisis in the way that he's pretending it is, and he's whipped up race mobs. Horrible. It's just humiliating for Tunisia. Dictatorship always is humiliating. Yeah. And it always tries to turn people against each other and against the weaker people in society. Yeah. It scapegoats people, and that's what's happening. And in terms of what I was saying before about the West not wanting democracy, the West made nice noises during the Arab Spring about, oh yes, we're very happy that Tunisia is turning into a democracy, but they weren't happy. And you can see now that they're paying Said. The EU in particular, the European Union, is paying him to keep the refugees, to keep the migrants there, just as they're paying the militias in Libya, and they're also paying Sisi in Egypt. They're paying him for two reasons. And the Americans pay Sisi too. They pay him because they want him to be nice to Israel and to persecute his own people, so that they're not in a position to resist Israel in any way, even by speaking, and to keep the siege going on Gaza from his side, and to share intelligence about what Hamas is doing with the Israelis. That's very important, to keep the so-called peace agreement, the Camp David agreements in place, even though Israel keeps violating them. So they're paying this guy there to do that, and to keep migrants in Africa and not let them cross the Atlantic, and not the Atlantic, sorry, the Mediterranean. Yeah. And they don't care, or they're happy if people like Said are organising rabble-rousing racist mobs to attack people, or to drive Africans into the desert where they will die of thirst, or paying the Libyan militias to torture these people. They think that's fine, So the tyranny in Africa and Asia, in the Arab world, is paid for and supported by the supposed duties in the West, which are falling further away from liberal democracy and further into fascism.
Yeah.
And I think it's a disaster. Quickly, one more thing in answer to your question. I mean, some people, and sadly some so-called progressives and leftists, they imagine that national liberation or anti-imperialism is a separate cause from the democratization of the Arab world.
Mm.
And I would argue that the two things are absolutely the same thing. That, you're not going to get the only type of Arab regime or Arab government which is ever going to do anything concrete and serious to change the situation for Palestinians is a democratic one.
Yeah, this is what I've been saying. The Arab states
yeah.
No, I'm just keep going. I love this.
Well, that's it. That's all. That I think that national, self-determination for the Arabs. When you've got a dictatorship, that's only one self determining it.
Mm-hmm.
Self-determination means democratization.
Exactly.
Of course, democracy is complicated, and there are different groups in society that need to argue things out between themselves, hopefully through democracy and not through violence at the ballot box. But if you can get representative governments, you can then get governments which are responsive to what their people want. And their people don't want them to cooperate with the powers that are murdering them. It's that simple. The people don't want the Saudi regime, even the Saudi public don't want the Saudi regime to be cooperating with Israel. The publics in the Arab world don't want their regimes to be offering military bases to the powers which are killing them. They don't want their governments to be looting the national resources and putting them into their bank accounts in Switzerland. These are just obvious things. And then people say, well, look at the West, it's all corrupt and imperialistic and it's democratic. Well, the point is that it's not democratic. There's 2 points. First point is that it's not democratic enough. Is that, parliamentary democracy is just the beginning. You need parliamentary democracy simply to stop gangsters staying there forever. You need to be able to get rid of them every 5 years or something. And then if you can get rid of them every 5 years, they won't be able to kill you. Then you can start the other work. You can start democratizing your societies in as many ways as you possibly can. You can start democratizing your workplace. You can start democratizing your local community, and so on. You can expand the democracy. You can bring your own ideas. And then the other point that I was going to make is that, of course, the Western democracies are democracies for Western people. We need democracies for Arab people who care about the priorities that Arab people have, which are going to be different from the priorities that Western people have, because we have a different culture and we have different needs, and we have millions and millions of people living in poverty, and millions of people, living without access to any kind of influence or power in society. So our societies have a lot of work to do, and at the moment we're prevented from doing that by gangsters. And we have great people. What you see in Syria, what you saw in Syria in the years when parts of the country were properly liberated, they were always under attack and in chaos. But there were parts of the country which weren't under the control of the Assad regime or Russia or Iran or the PKK or SDF or the Americans or the Turks or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or ISIS, or communities which were controlled by the people. And what did the people in those communities do? They set up democratic or semi-democratic local councils in order to organize affairs. And there was lots of brilliant, intelligent work under fire in the most difficult of circumstances. People set up local councils and women's centers and radio stations and all kinds of stuff. And you saw then what the Arabs could do. And also, when you go abroad, when you go to America or to France or Britain, you see that there are Arabs who are top doctors and top engineers, and they run businesses, and they've got they're in the computer industry, and they're in politics and so on, and they do really well, but they can't do that at home. So the problem is not the people. We've got a rich culture and we've got great people. The problem is political underdevelopment, which is enforced by foreign powers. I'm talking far too much. I think you should talk a bit more.
I think one, it's hard to interrupt you because you're a very good speaker, especially because it seems to me like you practiced, and I don't think you did, but like the way you were just able to not only just like continue talking, but like everything you say leads into the next thing, and it's all coherent, and I'm definitely not doing that right now, being as coherent as you. So, but I know I just absolutely love what you say. I don't have any more comments. I just entirely agree with what you've been putting down here. I should think of a question, but I do think I think if I technically go through I think it's been 50 minutes. I might have lost track of time. So I do think we should kind of wrap it up. First, I am reading through your book. It's a great book. I love it. It's great. I'm so definitely pleased that you have like such a commitment to democracy, such a commitment to these really important ideals for humanity. And I think that any listener with like brains sees that this is the side of the revolution that people should be supporting, not necessarily Assad. That you have like a much more positive view for what the life for Arabs should be like in the Middle East. And so thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being the first author to join me in this book podcast I've been trying to whip up. I was genuinely surprised I was able to get you to come here. So thank you very much for that.
It's been a great pleasure. It's been great to talk to you, and yeah, well, let me know when it's ready, and I will listen to it.
Yeah,
Thank
of
you so
course.
much,
Yeah.
and thank you to everybody who's listening.
Yeah. Alrighty. I'm gonna end the recording now. And everybody go buy his book and look at the links I put in the description.